Today I'd like to talk about the early impact of desegregation, particularly the two Brown decisions, the Brown v. Board of Education decision, followed by Brown 2, of course, on southern states. And did in fact southern states desegregate with a certain rapidity, or did they balk at what the federal courts were essentially telling them to do? So let's look at this topic. After the Brown decision, the southern states vehemently protested the power of the courts with regard to desegregation. In fact, the southern states were notoriously slow, at least many of them were, or a lot of them, in desegregating schools. That being the case, the courts came out with a second decision, Brown 2, which told the states to implement desegregation with quote-unquote deliberate speed. Thus the message is clear, at least according to the federal courts, that the southern states are in violation of the courts with regard to desegregation, and that they need to implement desegregation policies with greater speed. The idea of gradualism, you could say, was probably being abused by the southern states. A lot of people were mouthing or saying that they intended to desegregate gradually, but what gradually came to mean was not at all, essentially. Thurgood Marshall was quoted, I think it was during, I can't remember if it was during the Little Rock crisis or the James Meredith case, but he said something, gradualism should not take 90 years. And he was right on the money there, because in truth the southern states were not desegregating. In fact, I think what was happening is that the southern states were hoping that the federal government would basically ignore their attempts to defy segregation or desegregation rulings. In 1956, or I think it was 1956, a black woman by the name of Autherine Lucy attempted to enroll at the University of Alabama, even though that was her legal right, and according to the courts even, the state of Alabama just refused to enroll her. And many looked to this example as perhaps an indication that the federal government ultimately would not intervene if the southern states refused to desegregate. A year or so later, of course, comes one of the big desegregation cases, at least with regard to education in the United States, the so-called Central High School crisis, or the Little Rock crisis. Interestingly enough, Arkansas was probably one of the more progressive states among the various southern states, and Little Rock was a relatively progressive city by southern standards at least. So in some sense there's some irony that this event takes place in that particular locale. Equally ironic perhaps is that Orville Falbus himself, the governor of the state, had a reputation as being somewhat of a moderate. Now what will happen is, in order to gain re-election, Falbus will cater to the racist sentiments in his state. He takes a harder line regarding segregation, and thus he wins election, but at the same time he has to act upon those promises regarding hardline segregation. Thus, when there's an attempt to desegregate Central High School, Falbus will refuse the entry of the so-called Little Rock Nine, those 9 students who are deliberately chosen to desegregate that school. Now, what's interesting, of course, in this whole case is the reaction of the federal government. Eisenhower was very conservative in some ways regarding the use of the federal government to enforce desegregation. Eisenhower made the famous statement, "You can't change the hearts of man by law," and tended not to want to intervene in states' rights issues. But in the end, I think he has no choice in the Central High School case. You can't have a state simply violating federal law. Eisenhower recognized the supremacy of the Supreme Court. He feared anarchy, at least he stated that publicly. And thus, in the end, in response to the state of Arkansas sending in the National Guards to prevent the Little Rock Nine from entering Eisenhower himself will send in federal troops to allow those 9 individuals to enter Central High School. Now, what will happen is they of course will enter the high school. One will graduate that year, but then what Falbus will do, he will close down Little Rock schools, really again to prevent desegregation. And this in effect became a tactic used by other southern states, such as Virginia for instance. And thus what we see is really, in some sense, a last-ditch effort by southern states to prevent desegregation of public schools, simply again by closing down the schools. And so that's a really important case in the whole desegregation battle. Again, I think what's interesting there is Eisenhower's ultimate decision to use the federal troops. It points to the fact that the federal government will only tolerate to a certain extent Southern resistance, this idea of Southern massive resistance by whites. Now, of course, another big education case regarding desegregation occurred in Mississippi in the early 60s at the University of Mississippi, also known as Ole Miss. Now, to put this into context, Mississippi was an extremely racist state, had the reputation for being the most racist state in the Union. Certainly was the center of the white citizens' councils, those pro-segregationist white groups. In fact, some would argue that it was really the Citizens' Council that controlled the state of Mississippi. In addition to this, Mississippi had a very pro-segregation governor, Ross Burnett. He had been elected on a very pro-segregationist platform. And thus, when James Meredith, with the help of the NAACP, attempts to enter the University of Mississippi, Ross Barnett himself will stand at the door of the university saying, no, we're not going to admit you. And thus, again, we're going to see this confrontation between the state of Mississippi and federal authority. Now, Kennedy has replaced Eisenhower as president by this time, but in many ways their responses are similar. Kennedy's also reluctant to bring in federal troops. He fears the loss of white Democratic voters. At this point in history, the South was still heavily Democratic. In fact, all of the governors I'm referring to here were Democratic. And so what Kennedy tries to do initially, he tries to persuade Barnett to desegregate. Barnett will refuse, so Kennedy will send down the Justice Department to try to do that. He'll send in federal military police, which results in a riot. And then ultimately Kennedy, like Eisenhower, must call in federal troops, or decides to call in federal troops. And that's really going to force the integration of Ole Miss. And there you have it. I mean, that's another example of massive resistance, perhaps the most significant case of massive resistance. But in the end, Meredith does graduate, and integration moves forward, albeit with the harsh reality that Southerners are resisting, and in some sense they're resisting violently, in fact.